So my topic is the unusual position of this school, that it had what was called a writing school for many years. And since we don't have writing schools anymore, people often don't know what it means. And I think its significance has been overlooked. And so I want to try and rectify that today. Now, I gave a talk a couple of years ago about the school more generally. And I suppose the main message was that Christopher Wren, the architect in London, and Sir John Moore, the London merchant who came from Appleby, both shared a great vision and enthusiasm about the emerging world of international commerce in the 17th century. So Moore made his money through trading to India, but Wren also spent some time with the Hudson Bay Company. So they both believed in this new world system of commerce, which, as we know, emerged as the British Empire during the 18th and 19th century. And so they translated that enthusiasm for commerce into the design of two schools, one of whose purpose was to promote the skills necessary to make commerce happen. And so these two schools were in London at Christ Hospital, the writing school. This was near St Paul's Cathedral, now demolished in the early 20th century. And the other one was closer to where he came from originally, which was the Appleby School here. So we are the survivor of this pair of schools that were created by Moore and Wren to promote commercial education. And the form this commercial education took was very different to the traditional type of education provided in grammar schools. And this shows it very graphically. This is Sir John Moore's writing school, where you have everyone seated in a very disciplined way at desks designed to write on. And so a lot of the education was learning how to write in order to create business records and accounts. And obviously often associated with the writing was training in accounting and arithmetic. That went hand in hand with the writing. Now compare that to Eton at the same time. There are no desks at all in the Eton schoolroom. The Eton education was designed to encourage people's reading skills, so they were educated, they could read classical literature, and their oral skills. They could give a very persuasive speech. Now, some of our prominent figures from Eton still have these characteristics. I won't name any names, I think of them themselves. So this was a change in the style of education. And this occurred here as well, in that this schoolroom, this is the picture from the London school, but the schoolroom here was just the same sort of layout. So you could see what John Moore and Christopher Wren did as part of a bigger campaign to get the grammar school, the traditional grammar school, adapt to the modern age and teach writing and other commercially relevant skills as part of the curriculum. Now, interestingly enough, Moore himself attended Ashby Grammar School, probably between 1625 and 1635. Ashby Grammar School at that time was known as a reforming Puritan-based school. So it was not the conservative Anglican church type of school. It was Protestantism and reform and change. And the headmaster of Ashby Grammar School up till 1620 was a man called John Brinsley, and in fact Brinsley was sacked from his position as head because he was too radical in 1620. But why Brinsley is still known is that he wrote a book on the grammar school and how it should be reformed. And this is the front cover of it. Ludus Literarius, or the grammar school, showing how to proceed from first entrance into learning and through the school itself. Now, a lot of this book is simply about how you should teach Latin grammar in a more civilised way, rather than just expect people to learn it off by heart. But there's a whole chapter in this book on the importance of teaching children how to write. And this included details like how you should prepare your quill pen, how you should use it properly. And so, although Brinsley was no longer head of the school when Moore went there, this was the tradition of the school, that it was reforming the curriculum to include writing. As you know, the 17th century was a mixed period, and eventually, of course, Puritanism was defeated in a way with the restoration of Charles II. And in fact, it meant that the initial steps being taken to reform grammar schools ground to a halt. And so grammar schools didn't reform their curriculum very much during the 17th century. But people in the new age of commerce, people still needed to learn how to write. Now, there are lots of ways you could learn how to write. I mean, if you had a parent who could write, you might simply learn it in the home. There are different. If you think about, probably everyone here went through some transition of learning how to use a computer and a word processor. Just think of that, how that actually happened. It wasn't part of the school curriculum early on. You learnt it from friends, you taught yourself, you had classes you could go to outside schools. It was just like that with writing. And so what happened, in fact, was that you had independent writing masters setting up private schools to teach kids how to write, a bit like an IT training centre. And so this is an advert from one in the 17th century saying he's going to teach writing in all hands, arithmetic, merchants' accounts in the true Italian method, and this is Charles Snell, a writing master in London. Now, although he calls it his free writing school, it was not a free writing school. You paid fees. It meant it was free from being run by the church or by some other institution. And so if we look at writing masters in England during the 17th and 18th century, this is the pattern we see. So this is the late 17th century, it's just starting, then it booms during the 18th century and then drops. So Moore was endowing his school around about this period. This was when there was growing interest in teaching writing, but it was mainly being done privately. So just a few words, why was writing so important? Well, up until the 13th century, writing was mainly the preserve of the church. And so you've seen these pictures, the monastic scribe writing his books out, often with beautiful illuminations, and they were written on parchments. And then, of course, the rise of the age of commerce, 15th, 16th and 17th century, we then have this is a book published at the time, The Perfect Merchants, and this shows the merchant bookkeeper rather than the cleric. And what was interesting is that they were writing on paper rather than parchments. Basically, you had this big transition from parchment-based writing up to the 13th century, and this had been completely taken over by paper-based writing by the 16th and 17th century. Although it changed from parchment to paper, the instrument of writing remained the same, the quill pen. Now, a bit like the penny farthing bicycle, we tend to adopt a very patronising attitude to technologies of the past. It's seen as rather quaint. But this was serious stuff. This was how you wrote from essentially the 7th to 8th centuries right up to the 19th century. So one can ridicule the quill pen, but actually it was the primary writing instrument for 700 years, which is quite an achievement if you think about it. Now, why did it last so long? Because it was quite good, but it was complicated. It was not like taking your biro out of the drawer. And so you had, these are textbooks published at the time. This is how to make a quill pen, paring it down, cutting the nib properly. So there's a lot of knowledge there. And then writing with a quill pen wasn't straightforward either. So there was a lot of learning about how to use the quill pen properly. And so a writing master was teaching people how to write, how to make their pens, how to maintain their pens. This was the technology of the time. So Moore's mission at Appleby was an interesting one. He was in the world of commerce and knew that this skill of writing was becoming more and more important, but it was taking place outside of the mainstream schooling system, and so he wanted to reform the mainstream school system and to establish a writing school which was public. It wasn't private education, it was for people attending his school. I mean, this was an endowed school where I think you had to pay sixpence to register, but there were no other fees involved to be educated here. And large scale, not just sitting at the writing master's knee, but as we saw, the writing school at Christ's Hospital, 400 pupils, teenage boys, learning how to write at the same time. And so this involved the redesign of the schoolroom, and I think this is what is really underestimated about how significant this building is. Because in a sense, they were redesigning the schoolroom to imitate what the commercial office looked like with merchants' desks. So it wasn't an abstract thing, let's change the schoolroom. It was, let's make the schoolroom look much more like the merchant's counting house so that the pupils learn how to write in that context. So, it was an innovation to promote a new type of schoolroom for commercial education to learn how to write. But the aim was to combine this with traditional schools, of which there were two main types. The Latin school, which was to learn classical literature, learn Latin, and learn how to read traditional scripts, and elementary education, teaching basic literacy to children from all sorts of backgrounds. So we would now regard them as secondary and elementary schools, but in fact at this time it was more blurred. You might go to a Latin school when you were quite young, if you were doing quite well, and you might be still going to English school when you're getting on to 10 or 11 because you weren't picking everything up. So there's two missions then, to create the writing school but to link it to the Latin school and the English school. Now I think this is interesting because the merchant class also aspired to be educated gentlemen. So it wasn't that if you were a merchant, you just wanted your son to learn how to write and do the accounts. You wanted your son to become a worldly wise man of the society. And so the merchants were quite keen that their sons got classical education. So this was an attempt to combine the two, to both learn classics through a Latin school and to learn writing for commercial skills. So as well as the physical design of the school, the statutes of this school, which were published in the early 18th century, specified you have to appoint a writing master for all future time. These statutes mattered in those days. If you wrote something, the governors couldn't just say, well, we don't like that statute. You had to carry on doing it. And so actually it gave it a lot of durability. And so you needed a person who knew about writing and arithmetic, and he shall teach and instruct all boys of the foundation that shall come to write and cast accounts. Now this is quite important. All boys of the foundation that shall come to write and to cast accounts. In other words, any pupil who wanted to learn writing and accounts, they might be at the Latin school or the English school, but they would then go to the writing school as well. And so this is spelled out more clearly that if you were in the Latin school and you wanted to learn to write and to cast accounts, then every school day in the morning they would go to Latin school first and continue there until 10 of the clock. And then at 10 of the clock they would repair to the writing school and learn there for the rest of the day. So this is written down in the statutes that you should move around between the schools. My understanding is that this schoolroom, that probably they did the Latin here up until 10 o'clock, but then probably from 10 o'clock it turned into the writing school. It would be perverse if the writing school was somewhere else. As some historical accounts say, the writing school was in the East Wing. It doesn't make sense. If you design all these writing desks in this main room, then that's going to be where your writing school takes place. So as I say, Appleby survived, whereas Christ's Hospital Writing School has disappeared. And so we have survivals of the desktops and benches, which are now around the room as the wainscoting. This has interesting graffiti from former pupils, which we're also doing an investigation of, which we'll report about on a future occasion. And then in about 2002, someone took a metal detector around the grounds and they found these lead inkwells, which also appear to be survivals from the days of the writing school. Now, the other thing that the statute said was to say each master shall keep a register book where they will write the Christian name and surname of every scholar, and who shall pay 6 pence to the master who enters it. Now this statute has been very useful as far as we're concerned, because the registers for the three schools, the writing school, the Latin school and the English school, have survived. And in fact, Jack Smith, who was the head of the new primary school from the early 1950s, he found them in the stables after he'd taken up his job here. They are now in the Leicestershire Records Office, though they actually belong to the foundation. The writing school and English school have records from 1707 to 1837. The Latin school continued up until 1902. John Glover was probably the most well-known writing master at the school. That's his signature on one of the pages from the writing school register. But of course most of the register is rather difficult to read handwritten names of pupils. So a number of volunteers have undertaken the massive job of transcribing these pupil registers from these handwritten records. Basically, we've looked at all of the records, we've transcribed all of them, but this analysis I'm talking about really, for all three schools, looks from 1707 up to 1837. And the 1707, which was the first list, recorded everyone who was at the school, so we can treat that really as covering the previous 5 years. Okay, so a number of local history cafe participants, coordinated by Sonia Liff, where is she, at the back, transcribed 3,233 legible names from these registers. So what I'm going to tell you today is based on that work, so thank you to the local history cafe for that effort. Registrations then from 1702 to 1837. So basically, in the English school, we have the largest number of pupils, nearly 1,400 over this period. And then in the Latin and writing schools, we have about 900 registrations during this period. And if we look at this on a 5-yearly basis over this period of time, we can see the ebbs and flows of the fortunes of the different schools. So these green bars, this is the writing school, okay? So basically you can see two big waves of attendance at the writing school, one in the early 18th century, one towards the end of the 18th century. The largest school was the English school, which is this line here. And then the Latin school is this line, which, as you see, goes up and down rather more dramatically than any of the others. And maybe depending on what sort of reputation it's had at any particular moment in time. So what we can see then is that the English school had the highest number of registrations. It was reasonably consistent size of between 40 to 80 pupils. The writing school was next in size, but with more fluctuations, between 10 and 100, peaking in the 70s and 80s and 1805. The Latin school was the smallest, showing significant fluctuation between 10 to 65. So this information, I think, demonstrates that this unusual 3-school model that John Moore was pioneering was reasonably successful. I mean, it's attracted pupils to all of the schools in viable numbers. So that was the plan, and that's what happened. The biggest clientele were local boys going to the English school for their basic education, and the attractiveness of the other schools varied and could have reflected the standing of the master at the time. So if we look at the average number of registrations I've taken a 5-year period. I mean, registrations are recorded annually, and you paid your sixpence, then you didn't have to register again. You could carry on coming for as long as you liked. Most of the information we've got suggests people were around for 5 years or so as pupils of the school, so we've taken that as the estimate. So that shows that the English school had an average number of registrations. So in the school, let's say in the school at any one time, 56, writing 36 and Latin 34, with over 100 altogether. So it was a viable school. There's a difference in social makeup between the different schools. The English school provided basic education for village boys, whereas the Latin school provided classical education for the better off. So we've looked at the surnames of pupils at the two schools. So the English school shows a number of very well-known local families who have kids coming to the school for 100 years or more. And so I think there's 32 family names where more than 10 children came as pupils over this period of time. The Latin school, you don't have anything like that visibility of specific surnames, and it reflects a wider catchment area. They pioneered a new type of education, a writing school. They encouraged pupils from different schools to attend it. Well, who went in reality? It's one thing saying, I'm going to provide this new type of school and you're all welcome to come. Did they go or not? And so this is the key question that we've been trying to address. To what extent were pupils registered at the writing school also registered at either the Latin school or the English school? So we know that the statutes enabled this to happen, so it was one of the purposes of the school. But they would reflect different things. I mean, English school pupils, sons of local, not particularly well-off farming families mainly, or local tradesmen, they could be going to the writing school to try and move up in the world, that your dad only worked as a farm labourer, but you're going to learn to write, and so you can become a clerk to a lawyer in Ashby. I mean, that sort of upward social mobility. Latin school pupils pupils would suggest that the gentry were interested in diversifying the careers of their sons. So instead of it being either you run the family farm or you go into law or the church, which were the classic routes for the gentry, again, you can become a merchant in London, you can become part of this new trading community that we see growing around us. And finally, if we have pupils who are just coming to the writing school, then it suggests that this type of commercial education had developed a sort of self-sufficiency. It sort of existed in its own right, independent of the traditional English or Latin schools. So we've looked at the overlap between registrations in these different schools, and the results are quite positive. So this light blue, these are pupils who were registered only in the writing school and not in one of the other schools. These were the Latin school registrations, the orange ones, and these were the English school registrations, the dark blue at the bottom. And so if we look at the proportions then, we can say that at the beginning, say 15 to 20% of both the English school and the Latin school were going to the writing school. This went up to 45% for the Latin school some years later. At the end of the 18th century, nearly 70% of the English school pupils were going to the writing school. So, a lot of fluctuation, but also consistent presence of these pupils in the different schools. And if we look at the overall period then, what we find is that 40% of the pupils in the writing school only attended the writing school, 28% attended the English school as well, and 28% attended the Latin school. A tiny number went to both the writing English and Latin schools. Okay, so I think these findings are quite striking. If 40% of the pupils were only going to the writing school, then it does suggest that practical commercial education was self-sufficient. I mean, it was a standalone business school. You came from different locations to Appleby to learn the commercial skills of writing and accounting. That's what Appleby was known for. Then we've got an even split of just under a third, which overlap the English school and the Latin school. And so it suggests that the writing school was attractive to different social classes, from labouring up to the landowning gentry. So it was both serving as upward social mobility for the labouring classes and diversification for the gentry. The small overlap between English and Latin schools suggests that upward progression from learning the basic skills as a local lad in the English school and then going on to the Latin school occurred, but it wasn't very common. George Dews was a pupil at the writing school in 1835, towards the end of our period. He was raised at Piston Hill Farm in Blackfordby, but the family then moved to Norton Juxta Twycross in 1835. So he ended up going part of his life to Ashby School and part of his life to Appleby School. And he happened to write very extensive memoirs to the end of his life where he makes some comments on Appleby School. So we do have some comments from someone at the end of this period who compared Appleby School with Ashby School. And it suggests that even towards the end of the period, Appleby pupils were distinctive because of the presence of the writing school. So he said when he moved from Ashby School to Appleby, he found that the pupils at Appleby were much more advanced in arithmetic than he was coming from Ashby School, because arithmetic and accounting were being taught in the writing school, where there wasn't an equivalent to that at Ashby. He described the English school pupils as local and rough. He gives many interesting accounts of the folk at Norton and Appleby who he regards as much more uncouth than the people he was brought up with in Blackford, particularly in their language. He describes the Latin school pupils as coming from distant parts. The aristocracy was there, and they were paid great homage by the lads of the other school. Now, this is an interesting observation, because this is something I'd like to investigate further. He says there was a line of demarcation between Latin and English schools, and all intimacy between them was forbidden. Now, this did lead over the next so this is the end of the 1830s. Over the next 20 or 30 years, they were split in two, and the wall, as you know, the wall down the side, was built. So this line of demarcation turned from being told what to do by the masters to a brick wall to separate the English school boys from the Latin school boys. Now, in my view, this goes completely against the philosophy of the school that More had built. And even at the time, even though they said there was a line of demarcation, you had pupils from the English school at the writing school, and you had pupils from the Latin school at the writing school. So the school statutes were saying the local boys should mix with the sons of the gentry to go to the writing school together. So the notion that they shouldn't talk to each other, to me, this is something that emerged in the 19th century. And ultimately, it led to the closure of the writing school in 1861 and a complete split and hostility between the English school for the local kids and the Latin school. Yes, the one thing the two schools had in common is that the masters thrashed the children an enormous amount of the time. Let's just look at a few more pupils that went to the writing school over this period to try and get a sense, well, was it enabling pupils to acquire these new skills which could lead to new careers? Now, we haven't got a definitive answer to that, and it's something we're talking about thousands of people here, and it is quite difficult tracing their careers. You'd think finding their births would be relatively straightforward, because everyone was supposed to register their birth in the local parish, but even finding basic details is quite difficult. But we're trying to pursue that. So inevitably what we tend to know is people are more prominent. Now, the most prominent person associated with Appleby School is William Huskisson MP. He attended the writing school in 1782 and the Latin school in 1783. He's known to history because he was killed by George Stephenson's rocket in 1830. Now, it's an interesting story, it's a good story and so on, but it doesn't really tell you. The relationship of William Huskisson to the school is pretty marginal in that story. He just happened to come here. I don't think anyone suggested he learned something at Appleby to encourage him to jump under George Stephenson's engine. So I'll look more closely at did he learn something from the school which contributed to his career before his unfortunate end. Now, because he's famous, there are lots of biographies of Huskisson, and most of them say he was the descendant of country gentlemen long settled in Staffordshire. This is wrong. He's actually from an Appleby family of farmers, which were linked to the school quite closely for many years. So the Huskisson family, William Huskisson the first, arrived in Appleby at the end of the 17th century. He was described at the end of the 17th century as a poor husbandman, a farmer who probably didn't, if he owned any land, it was a tiny amount, it was his backyard, and didn't have a lot of wealth. But by 1720, he was defined as a yeoman, which meant he owned the freehold of his land and was fairly comfortably off. 9 of his descendants attended Appleby School during the 18th century, and many of them registered in the 3 schools. And we know from the family records that they tended to start English school aged between 6 and 9, the Latin school between 9 and 13, and the writing school between 9 and 12. So, English and Latin, yes, primary and secondary it overlaps. Writing school, and I think this is where people have been a bit mistaken over the years, not learning the basics of writing at the age of 6, but learning writing as a skill that you could use in a business context from the age of 9 onwards. I mean, when you were slightly older. So the writing school was not basic literacy, it was learning how to write for a particular purpose. Most of the Huskissons were pupils at school for 5 or more years, and I think the Huskissons is a good example of, as we've seen, he started a poor farmer but became a yeoman, and then the kids became more prosperous. It was upwardly mobile farming family based in Appleby. They were keen to use the full range of education to improve their kids so they could do better than the parents. So it's a good illustration of that, I think. And who knows? William Huskin I moved to Appleby in 1697, which is the same year the school was open. Maybe it's an early example of parents looking for a good school in a neighbourhood and then settling there to get the benefits of it. So the second generation, i.e. William I's sons, show an interesting pattern of continuing the land-based path for the eldest son, who was designated to inherit the land and the farm of the father, and alternative paths pursued by some other children into the world of commerce. So the eldest son, William Huskisson II, went to the English school and the writing school. He didn't go to the Latin school, and he probably was determined right from the beginning that he would look after the family farm. So he probably helped run the family farm until he inherited in 1747. There were family connections to some merchant wealth, which is too complicated a story to go into detail now, but as well as him becoming a more prosperous farming family, it looks like there was some money coming in from other relatives who had links to the merchants in the City of London, and so eventually led to a move from Appleby to the Oxley Manor estate near Wolverhampton, which also acquired a neighbouring estate in 1774. And this is where the Staffordshire story comes from, because this Huskisson, from the second generation, then became described as Esquire of Oxley, a gentleman of moderate fortune, long settled in Staffordshire. And he wasn't long settled in Staffordshire, he was a newcomer whose family had grown from being poor farmers to better off farmers, and had been able to move. Now his brother, Samuel Huskisson, who was not scheduled to inherit the farm or the land, he went to the English school, the Latin school and the writing school, took more advantage of the educational opportunities, and he moved to London as a merchant, became apprenticed to a London merchant in 1716. So you've got these two routes in the family, staying with the land or looking for careers in the new world of commerce, particularly in London. The third generation were left money from a relative, an uncle, who was a London merchant. And so they were able to continue that upwardly mobile path, and they ended up inheriting Oxley Manor and living this life of country gentlemen. Now the fourth generation then, and this is William Huskisson, the MP, actually show a shift into what you would call the professions, rather than either running a farm or becoming a merchant themselves. And so the two sons in the fourth generation, William Huskisson and Richard Huskisson, the family no longer lived in Appleby, but they attended Appleby School as boarders to both the writing school and the Latin school in the 1780s. their father remarried, and it looks as though they didn't fit in too comfortably with the new domestic arrangements. So they left home and went to stay with a great uncle in Paris, Dr. Richard Gem. He was the doctor to the British Embassy, and so he was very well connected to the British political elites. However, Gem was also a very active Republican and Enlightenment thinker, and so he was closely linked to the leaders of the American and French revolutions, who were also in Paris at this time. So these two Huskisson boys, after going to the writing school and Latin school at Appleby, lived in Paris during the decade of the French Revolution with someone who was very linked to the British Embassy in Paris and was linked to Thomas Jefferson and others from the revolutionary forces around at the time. So let's look a bit more closely then. Did any of the writing skills that William Huskisson possibly contribute to his later successful and prominent career? Now, maybe the intention was that, given his great uncle was a doctor, that he learned medicine, but in fact, William wasn't interested in that, but he did learn French, and he got a job in a bank in Paris as an office clerk in the bank. That suggests that maybe some of his writing skills from the school were relevant. He witnessed the French Revolution and then continued with the bank. But as the revolution unfolded, he also found an additional pastime of taking notes of the meetings of the more radical Republicans, the Jacobins, and he conveyed these notes to a friend at the British Embassy. So, writing skills again, going to meetings, recording what happened at the meeting, went down so well that he was appointed as private secretary to the British ambassador, Earl Gower, who had just arrived in Paris. His initial career then wasn't as an MP making profound speeches as a politician. His early career was using his clerical skills and writing skills, which ended up as a job in the British Embassy. And then Britain fell out with France shortly after the French Revolution, and so the ambassador was recalled in 1792, and Huskisson accompanied him. So again now, back in London, his administrative skills enabled him to be appointed as the superintendent of a new office set up in London, the Aliens Office. There was a massive influx of refugees from Paris, because this was when the reign of terror had been unfolding in the French Revolution. So many refugees were coming into London. He ran the office, which was to manage that flow, and that led quickly to him becoming chief clerk to a minister for war. And then in 1795 he actually was appointed as a government minister himself. So this was a pretty spectacular, rapid rise. But I say, it wasn't through a political route, it was through an administrative, managerial route, which led in this way. And then he became an MP shortly after that, and that was the basis for his career. I think it's quite interesting, the prominent figures from Appleby, John Moore never fitted into the Tory Whig division that emerged in the 17th century, and so although many histories call him a Tory or whatever, he tried to hover around in between, which was a difficult life with the new two-party system. And the same with Huskisson. One minute they called themselves moderate Tories, the next minute they called themselves independent Whigs. These were people, again, who didn't fit comfortably into one of these, and so embarked on a professional political career for the rest of his life. So that's one professional route. His brother, Richard Huskisson, was more influenced by the great uncle and qualified as a medical doctor, and so he ended up with a career as a Navy surgeon. Now, one of William Huskisson's patrons, Henry Dundas, was the Minister of War, and he sent an expeditionary force at the same time that William Huskisson was being promoted. He sent an expeditionary force to conquer the French colonies in the Caribbean. Richard Huskisson ended up as part of this expeditionary force and participated in the conquest of Martinique, St. Lucia and Guadeloupe. The expedition went wrong when they tried to conquer what's now called Haiti, and the slaves were already in rebellion, and they formed an alliance with the part of the French army that supported the French Revolution, and the British troops were besieged in Port-au-Prince, and most of them died from yellow fever, and it looks like that was the fate of Richard Huskisson. So, the Huskissons, a sort of upwardly mobile farming family from Appleby. The next family I'll just look at briefly arose from this new phase of economic development and commerce, the Industrial Revolution. So the early 18th century was still primarily wealth based on trade. Towards the end of the 18th century, we saw manufacturing arise and a new basis for wealth. Richard Arkwright was one of the leading entrepreneurs, best known for his factory, which was probably the first factory in the world, Cromford Mill. 5 Arkwrights were registered at the writing school between 1790 and 95. And investigation shows that these were the grandsons of Richard Arkwright, the entrepreneur. Now, I think this is quite an interesting story. The senior Richard Arkwright, the entrepreneur, was quite uneducated, though made a successful business career for himself. This 2 generations down did have education and then were successful in their own and different ways. So those are the 5 Arkwright boys that attended the writing school here at Appleby. So our records have their actual signatures. So their parents were the son of Richard the entrepreneur, who lived in Bakewell, and the grandfather, as I said, was Sir Richard Arkwright, the well-known entrepreneur. Now, it looks very likely that the decision to send the grandsons to the Appleby Writing School was pushed by the grandfather himself because of his own experience of a lack of education, particularly in writing skills. So he was born in Preston, the 13th child of a poor tailor. Now, if families sent kids to school, well, it was the oldest, maybe 1 or 2 of the older ones went. If you were the 13th child, you weren't going to get sent to school. So he didn't have an education, but he made £50 million from his cotton factories. But as a rich, successful man, he was obsessed with anxiety about his ability to deal with his business correspondence. And so, from a biography close to time, when considerably more than 50 years of age, feeling that the defects of his education placed him under great difficulty and inconvenience in conducting his correspondence and in the general management of his business, he encroached upon his sleep in order to gain an hour each day to learn English grammar and another hour to improve his writing. So here you've got a successful businessman who knows that writing is important to run a business. It seems pretty likely that he exerted influence on his son to say, look, send the grandsons to, there's an interesting school at Appleby where they've got a writing school where he can learn some of those skills. This was a very rich family. Although they weren't aristocracy, they'd made a fortune from the mills. And so they commissioned Joseph Wright of Derby to paint the 5 grandsons. So these are the only children really where we've got pictures of the pupils painted at the time they were pupils, which is quite amazing. really. So Richard is the eldest, Robert second eldest, and then the third one is Peter. The daughter, of course, wasn't sent to school, which was the practice at the time, and then these are the two younger sons. It looks as though the original Sir Richard Arkwright's son didn't quite share the values of the old man. Sir Richard, if he saw any mill on the market, he would buy it. And I think, in fact, his wife left him in the end because she couldn't stand him coming home and telling her that he'd bought another mill. The first thing Richard, the father of the kids at the school, did after the old man had died was to sell off most of the mills and to switch his career to property and government stocks and banking. And so, what did that mean as far as the school was concerned? Well, he didn't want his kids going to Appleby Writing School for a good commercial education. He wanted them to go to the top place. So they were taken out of Appleby and they were sent to Eton, because that's what a rich man would do if they could. They'd send their children to Eton. So you can see that these views about the value of education were always different, conflicting views. And while the senior Arkwright probably wanted his grandsons to have a sound commercial education, their father just wanted them to go to the top elite grammar school in the land, which was Eton. So what happened to them all? Well, they all became personally wealthy, which isn't surprising because, they inherited vast amounts. So it was new money. This is what you'd call capitalist new money. It wasn't inherited wealth from a long aristocratic line. And of course this, as you know, caused a great deal of snobbery among the traditional landed classes. So I think what was the term? Yes, they called the father the richest commoner in Europe. So he was worth £350 million. But now, the family, I think, is a great illustration of the conflicted view of Britain's new industrial class on whether they wanted to be industrial businessmen or whether they wanted to be country gentlemen. I mean, this was if you got a load of money, you could buy yourself a country estate, you could be a country gentleman. And if you look at the fortunes of the five boys, they just split between the two routes. So two of them, Richard and John, they never were interested in business or anything. They got their inheritance. They didn't become factory managers or bankers. One of them was an MP, but that was more of a vocation than actually doing anything serious with it. And although they came from this new industrial class, they lived their lives as country gentlemen, one in Normanton Turville, which is near Hinckley, and one in Hampton Court, which is not Hampton Court in London, is near Leominster in Herefordshire. Another one followed them into land, but did apply some of his skills of management to, as well as a career in banking, he managed his land in a way of modernising agriculture and raising livestock. And that was at Dunstall Hall, not far from here. Two of them went into business, and that's Robert and Peter, who both embraced the family career of factory management. Robert ran the Masson mill at Matlock for 25 years. But again, the power of these things is extraordinary. When the eldest Richard died young, then he was moved from the factory and told to run the estate. So there was family pressure. Be a landed gentleman. Don't carry on running the mill. Peter Arkwright stands out as the one who really devoted his life to cotton mill development, and so was very successful and well known as one of our leading business figures, running both the Masson mill and the Cromford mill. So, what can we say then with this diverse range of careers of five boys from the school? What was the impact of the commercial education they all received as boys at Appleby Writing School? Now, for the two country gentlemen, it looks as though it was irrelevant. For the other three, it probably played some sort of role. Peter, who became the successful businessman, it's interesting, our registers have enough detail to show that he joined the writing school within 6 months of his arrival, much more quickly than any of the other boys did. And so some of the other boys spent 4 years in the Latin school before going into the writing school to learn some commercial skills. So maybe Peter had a propensity for that type of activity from early on, but certainly he went to the writing school and he became a very successful businessman. Okay, I'll just wrap up now with 3 brief vignettes of different routes of families who had children coming to the school during that period. The first story is simply that you can go on as much as you like about the curriculum and learning skills and pursuing careers, but sometimes fortune becomes more important than what you've learned for yourself. And the Grundys were a good example. They had many children coming to the school here. The key figure, William Grundy, from the late 17th century, was a baker at Appleby. But he did well for himself. He married into a landed family. There was a family at Sutton Cheney called the Swinfens, and he married the Swinfen, Anne Swinfen, the daughter of that family. And again, this is a complicated story which I won't go through in detail, but essentially through that family link with the Swinfens, 2 of the Huskisson boys ended up inheriting the wealth of a Swinfen who had become a rich merchant in London. And that's how they ended up as owning estates near Wolverhampton in Staffordshire. So they went to the writing school, they went to the English school, but in fact it was fate in terms of marriage of the family that actually shaped their prospects in life. A vignette about the landed gentry, the Martin family from Anstey. So this again shows this possible different routes that children from the landed gentry could play. They both attended the Latin school and the writing school here at Appleby. Robert Martin followed the very conventional son of the gentry route. He went to Cambridge University, he became a vicar. He was the vicar of Ratby and Groby. We do have his signature somewhere on the walls here, Robert Martin. William Martin, his brother, interestingly, did not go to Cambridge, but as soon as he'd finished his learning at the writing school here at Appleby, became steward of the Groby Manor estate, which included Bradgate Park. So, in other words, it was oriented towards the land, but it was a management job. So, one vicar, one land estate manager, showing this diversification of careers arising from the gentry. Then a completely contrasting story is the Dews family, which, if you like, were a family on the slippery slope of decline. There were 3 Dews here in the early 19th century. They were descendants of Benjamin Dews, who ran a huge grocery store in Ashby. It's one of the tallest buildings, 19th century buildings on Market Street. He not only ran his successful grocery store, but he speculated on rice during the upheavals in the US and made a fortune. So they came from quite a rich retail family, but in fact were on a sort of slippery slope. And in fact, the father was a farmer who, rather than an upwardly mobile farmer, was a downwardly mobile farmer. And so it's a constant shift from one farm which isn't doing very well to another farm which then doesn't do very well to another farm. It's a sad story, really. So as you know, I said George Dews, they moved from Blackfordby to Norton. I mean, this was because the family was in decline, they had to leave one farm and go to another. Now it's interesting because George Dews didn't have much prospects, and so this rise of empire at this time was a route. If your career prospects were not looking too brilliant in England, then why not try overseas? And so he emigrated to Australia, then I think spent a decade or more travelling, working on whaling ships in the South Seas, participated in the Californian gold rush, and came back then to England in the 1860s with enough money to buy a farm himself and settle down. But the more interesting case is his brother, Harry Dews. Now, Harry Dews went to the writing school here, and after going to the writing school here, he was hired as the writing master at Appleby School. So he was obviously quite talented and started with a career there. He joined the Indian civil service because Britain was enlarging its stake in India at this time in 1844, and he was the most successful of the family. Now again, I would think that drew on his skills that he'd acquired at the writing school. But if you read the story of this family, it's Harry Dews who was sending money from India, which was then bailing out the other members of the family. So the father, whose farms were getting less and less successful, was reliant in the end on Harry's income. Brother Jack Dews ended up in some indentureship in Lullington, I think, which he didn't like, and so Harry bought him out of it. So we're seeing a new direction of career here into the British Empire, and this was a family in decline, and the new opportunities were overseas, but they seemed to draw upon these commercial and bookkeeping skills that had been acquired at Appleby. Okay, so in conclusion then, with Appleby Writing School, we know about it for the 140 years since it was established in 1697. I'd say it made an unusual and distinctive contribution to British education with a record of success. I think the evidence suggests it was a forerunner of the modern business school, but it was in the age of the quill, pen and paper rather than in the modern era. It was part of this three-school model which combined liberal education with vocational education, and it was oriented to all social classes, from the local labouring class to the gentry in different parts of England. I think it was sadly, it was a victim. I mean, although educational reform is a positive story, after all, 19th century reform led to universal access to elementary education by people, so no one's detracting from that. But in a sense, the writing school was an unfortunate victim of that period of reform, though it seems to me the evidence shows it was well ahead of its time and socially inclusive. So an interesting question is, why did it disappear? I've said there seemed to be this sort of vicious class divide that was developing in the 19th century, which seemed completely at odds with the philosophy of rich people like More a century earlier, who their philosophy was to make education available for everyone. So there was this new class divide. Now, a positive story is the old grammar schools started to modernise their curricula. So instead of just being hidebound into learning Latin grammar, they started to teach modern subjects, mathematics, science, foreign languages, etc. So you could say, well, you didn't need that old model, because now instead of having these separate pillars of the system, we've modernised the curriculum. The third aspect, of course, would be that the technology of the quill, pen and on paper came to an end, and actually the timeliness of its role drew to a close. 1837, which is the last year of our analysis, of course, was the year of the coronation of Queen Victoria. It was also the year in which Joseph Gillett opened a factory called the Victoria Works in Graham Street in Birmingham to make steel pens to replace quill pens. And in his advert, he gives the number of pens manufactured at the Victoria Works in 1837. 35,008,452. And then in 1938 had gone up to over 44 million steel pens. So I think that's a fairly graphic illustration that the technology of writing was changing. But just to add, I spoke in defence of the quill earlier. Before these steel pen manufacturers got underway, we were importing millions of feathers from Eastern Europe to manufacture quill pens. So the quill pen had become mechanised and mass-produced, but that was the basis then for the shift to steel-based manufacturing, and that consigned the quill pen ultimately to history. Okay, that's my little story of the writing school.